Anyways, Chris Quilty is going to just give a quick presentation, and then we're going to go on to our space domain awareness and traffic management working group panel.
Great. Thank you. And again, for those of you that don't know me, my background, I'm a financial analyst. I spent 20 years as a stock analyst at Raymond James, writing research on companies in the satellite and space industry. And I've been independent for about 7 years, small 10-person group that does investment banking and research on everything satellite and space. So question, how many people here have been to the conference before or read the reports? Hands up. So just about everybody. And I know one of the things for the people that are going to be doing the writing this year is you always kind of want to do something different. And each report, they do have a little bit of a different angle to them, but there's a couple of things that are in those reports every single time. And one of those things that you keep seeing in there is space solar power. And I'll make I'll follow up on it later, but for those of you that don't know the intricacies of the space solar power industry, it's unique from the terrestrial. So let's jump into it. And first, let's start off with some history. How much solar power goes into space? And these are the numbers. The biggest portion of power demand is for geosatellites. And you can see, we're in a downtrend here that pop up in 2022 was mostly C-band replacements, but we'll talk about it further. The demand for geosatellites is down and probably never coming back to where it used to be. But this was, more than half of the industry's demand. Then you got LEOs, and this is the thing we're all focusing on. Is you can see that hockey stick. You love that in the finance world, maybe in space, but we got lots of stuff going up in LEO. MEO orbits, mostly O3b and their mPOWER. And then you got some crazy other stuff. So we're not going to talk about those bottom two again. They're kind of immaterial around the numbers. But what I do want to talk about is the top two. GEO, as I mentioned, was most of the demand. And what happened was, beginning in 2015, when SpaceX and OneWeb popped up on the scene, the satellite operators stopped ordering satellites and just really were putting up replacement capacity. And there were a couple things going on. You had this move towards high throughput satellites where, the one Jupiter 2 satellite, Viasat 2 satellite from Viasat had more capacity than all of the satellites over North America. So that was a trend. And this is just a commercial. There are some military and civil satellites, but they're pretty stable. So we're not going to talk about this much because this is not a driver for future demand. What is a driver is what's happening in LEO. And if you cycle back your brain 5 years ago, commercial effort in LEO. Few imaging satellites, like a couple dozen. And beyond that, you had the Iridiums and Global Stars that tried to build these constellations in the 90s, and they all went bankrupt. And so people just, whatever on LEO. But then something changed, and that something was SpaceX, honestly. They took a zero off the cost of launch. And in addition to that, they made launch available because, if you remember, it wasn't too long ago where, the Air Force would have test satellites sitting on a stand for 10 years because they couldn't get it on a launch. And SpaceX is launching every 2 days. So that upturn there is a combination of a lot of CubeSats in the earlier days, but you're seeing a lot more larger satellites. And that's one of the trends. What is going to drive power demand? Well, one thing is satellites are getting bigger and more powerful. The GEOs, as I mentioned on the previous slide, they went from, whatever it was, 5 up to 9 kilowatts per satellite. Well, even these little guys like Planet that started with a 3U CubeSat weighing 5 kilograms, they're now building 200 kilogram satellites. And as they get bigger, they need more power. The other thing is, thanks to the SDA, optical crosslinks are starting to become standard on a lot of certainly communication satellites, maybe on EO. That's a lot of power requirements to put on 4 optical crosslinks. And then just the satellites themselves, right? You're getting more onboard processing and edge computing and encryption and security and other things that just need more power. So if geo is not the driver in the future, what are going to be the drivers in the future? And the biggest one are the mega constellations. And by this, I mean SpaceX, Amazon, not Telesat, they're dead. But it's Mangata, it could be Rivada, there's a number of these mega constellations. Then the LEO market, which I'm going to make different from mega constellations. They are all in LEO, but these are the smaller constellations. Think of Hawkeye 360 or Black Sky or Maxar or others. We're hearing a lot about this in the conference. This was a 0 on my historical chart, right? There was no power required for cislunar, in the kind of commercial way that we're talking about it here. And then we've also had some discussions about space-based solar power. That's a big one. Like that's the biggest one, obviously, if it happens. So let's talk about a problem that the mega constellations have. And you're saying, Chris, why do you have a geo satellite where we're talking about mega constellations? And this is because I want to make a point. That satellite, which actually is the Jupiter 2, I couldn't get a Jupiter 3 image until this morning and work it in. But anyways, the size of that panel there is about 100 square meters of solar panel, generates 20 kilowatts. Took Hughes 6 years to build this thing, $650 million. Now, what are they competing against? Here's SpaceX, right? That is satellite proportional to that geo. And they're building these things for $500,000 a piece. They can crank out about 20 gigabits per second. And that little satellite has 5 kilowatts of power. Like, you look at those two satellites, like, what's wrong there? Right? And what's wrong there is the fact that they have massive amount of solar panels on there. Now, who knows why they have a bunch of solar panels on there? Anyone? Because they're using rooftop solar. Why are they using rooftop solar? I mean, we know SpaceX likes to do things cheap. I mean, they're using fire extinguishers for their propellant tanks. Are they using rooftop solar because it's cheap? Well, no, the answer is they're using it because they have no choice. And the reason they have no choice is the space solar power industry is a very small, has a very small supply. And to put it in perspective, I looked at the numbers. Last year, globally, there was 226,000 megawatts installed solar globally. And that's up from like 95,000 megawatts 5 years ago. Anybody want to guess how much production capacity we have in our industry? 226,000 installed last year. 1. The problem that SpaceX has is they're putting up about 6 megawatts a year. There's not supply, so they had no choice but to use rooftop solar. Now, rooftop solar, I mean, it works, but it's a bad solution. Why? Well, because your efficiency is about 17% versus the triple junction 3.5 material used on that Jupiter 3 satellite. So it's not efficient. And then here's the other big problem is silicon can't survive in space. So after about 15 years, that Hughes satellite will lose 20% of its energy generating potential. That Starlink satellite will lose 20% in a year. So what you have is a satellite that is life limited by its solar power. So they're over provisioning the panel by about 4x because it's inefficient and it's dying quickly. And that's the long pole in the tent, right? That's what determines the life of a SpaceX satellite. So they got a power problem. How are they going to solve that power problem? Well, they have out the dimensions for the Gen 2, and guess what? The Gen 2 is more than half the size of a basketball court. And again, this is all done to scale. So they are throwing up a ton of very heavy, very life-limited crystal silicon panels into space. Now, this is not just their problem. So I listed out a number of notable mega constellations, which includes, the US DoD. They're putting up, they won't tell us the number, 1,000, 1,100. I think IRIS-2, which is the recently announced European program, is only 170, they're saying now, satellites, but they'll probably be more powerful. Rivada, I don't know whether they'll make it. OneWeb, I guessed, because they haven't they don't have a Gen 2 vendor yet, right? That's probably a reasonable guess. But if you look at this, just the SpaceX Gen 1 is using about 7.5 megawatts a year versus a 1 megawatt supply. So we haven't seen specs for Amazon, but guess what Amazon's going to be flying? Rooftop solar. So what does this look like? Now, I left SpaceX off this chart, but what you're seeing is the annual demand. And the reason it kind of peaks up there is I'm taking account of the fact that Rivada really will just launch in a 2-year window, and same thing, OneWeb Gen 2. So this is kind of like modeling out, the actuals. If I were to put SpaceX on this chart, here's 2 options. If we use their Gen 1 power, that original little satellite I showed you, and assume 4,500 satellites, I think it's about 6 megawatts a year. If, on the other hand, they now have the Gen 2 bus coming out, which by my estimate is about 56 kilowatts per satellite. Remember that Hughes satellite was only 20. And they, instead of building 4,500, maybe they do the 7,500 they're licensed, then SpaceX alone will be using 105 megawatts a year of capacity. So that's the big one, the mega constellations, but even all of these small constellations. So I went through 300 plus constellations that have been announced. You throw out the Chinese, you throw out the Russians, you throw out the total vaporware. And so I only took companies that were funded, and they could either be VC funded, or let's just say they're, large established private companies. So it was about 70 and 40. And then I went through and I looked at the bus size and the power requirements and modeled out. If all these guys build it out, here's what you see is, the demand here just in this stuff is going to exceed the industry capacity. Now you could say, oh, Chris, not all these things are going to be built, but yeah, true. But there's other ones that haven't been announced that'll fill in the gaps, because, when I originally in 2015 was imagining what mega constellations were, I thought there were 2, SpaceX and OneWeb. That was it. I was wrong, right? Because I had a whole bunch on that slide before. So this is the third market I talked about, cislunar. So this is a 0 historically. What could it be on a go-forward basis? So this is actually kind of interesting. I went through a spreadsheet I had of like a couple hundred companies that are doing stuff in cislunar. So what is cislunar? I should define it, because there is no definition, no authoritative definition I found, but generally it's everything from LEO orbit out to the L2 Lagrange point on the moon, but let's just say Earth to moon and all the activity that happens there. But to define it better, it's stuff that happens in space, like when the transaction happens there. So these 75 companies are funded, but just those six on the chart, they've raised $1 billion. So kind of real money. And lunar is part of cislunar, but I just wanted to break it out to show specifically what's happening on the lunar side. 15 funded companies, and it's a little under $500 million that these companies have raised. And then finally, we've talked about space-based solar power a lot, so I'm not going to bludgeon it. What I would note is I highlighted some dates here. So that Solaris program that we heard about yesterday, that thing was created out of thin air last year. There was like 0 discussion of it. Then Russia attacks Ukraine, and suddenly we get concerned about energy security, and they're funding space-based solar power. Japanese actually wrote it in the national space law in December of 21. They could demonstrate it by 2025. The UK has been way out in front with the Cassiopeia program, demonstrator by 2030. NASA has so many studies on space-based solar power that they announced they're going to do a study of the studies. And it's a year later, and they still haven't told us what they found, but hopefully. Air Force, we heard from them. They've got the Spider demonstrator. And then the big one here is the Chinese. The Chinese have said they're going to spend $40 billion to create space-based solar power. They're doing actually in November, they announced they're going to demonstrate it off their space station. And why do they want to do that? Well, they've got energy security issues, but they also have Belt and Road countries that they want to pull into their orbit. So this is important, and I hope we kind of get off our duff here in the US and start doing something serious about it. Because the people have done reports and they said, hey, this stuff is economical today. So what does it look like? Again, I'm leaving off the mega constellation. We already did that. These 3 markets, and I'm almost done. Here's what LEO looks like, running up to around 5 megawatts. Cislunar, who knows? And, you get a little bit of demonstration programs on space-based solar power, but you're running up, towards 7 megawatts a year of requirements. Who's out there on the supply outlook? And I got funny letters there with the font, but so historically, the big three producers here in the US were Boeing Spectralab, Azure out of Germany, owned by 5N Plus out of Canada, and Solero, which is owned by Rocket Lab. Also, you got Microlink and Sharp do a little bit in there. And these guys have really not shown an ability to scale. They've been producing about the same amount every year forever. But there are some new kids on the block, people that are trying to take that silicon and actually make it work in space. But most of these companies, I know Celestial did like a $10 million A round recently. TSEC is actually a big Taiwanese provider, but this is what we got working for us right now. I may have missed some, so please, if you know, let me know. But if you've always been asking the question, why do they have that space-based solar power thing in the industrial base report? Well, now you know. Any questions?